The bus ride to Ridgewood High was long and quiet. Dante sat by the window, watching the scenery shift from busy city streets to quiet suburban neighborhoods. Every house looked the same, neatly arranged, well-maintained and predictable. Everything in this town felt controlled, structured, and Dante had a feeling that there wasn't much room for people like him here. He had been through this before. New school, new faces, the same old feeling of being watched. From the moment he stepped onto Ridgewood High's campus, he felt it. The way conversations stopped for just a second as he walked past. The way some students glanced at him, then quickly looked away, pretending they hadn't been staring. Teachers were polite, too polite. Their smiles were tight, their voices just a little too careful. Dante ignored it. He knew how this worked. Rule number 1, stay quiet, stay out of trouble, blend in. The morning passed without much issue. He sat through class, answered when called on, and kept his focus on the work. But by lunchtime, the feeling of being watched had settled into his skin like an itch he couldn't scratch. Dante walked into the cafeteria, tray in hand, scanning for a place to sit. Most tables were full, groups locked in conversations that clearly didn't include him. A few students exchanged looks, whispering, some even smirking. Dante exhaled slowly. Same old routine. Then he spotted an empty seat near a guy who seemed too busy scrolling through his phone to care. Not ideal, but it would do. Dante had barely set his tray down when a voice cut through the noise. "You lost?" Dante turned. A blond guy with an easy smirk and too much confidence leaned back in his chair. A few others at his table watched with amusement. Dante kept his face blank. "Didn't know I needed a map." The guy chuckled, shaking his head. "Just making sure. Not a lot of new faces around here." Dante caught the hesitation in his voice. The unspoken part of that sentence hung in the air. He met the guy's stare, unreadable. "Guess I'm the exception." The smirk widened, but there was something else behind it. Amusement, curiosity, maybe something more? "Welcome to Ridgewood, man." Dante didn't respond. He just sat down and picked up his fork. The message was clear. This was just the beginning. Dante wasn't looking for trouble. He just wanted to finish school, keep his head down, and stay out of people's way, like he always had. But he also knew that some people wouldn't let that happen. And Connell Hastings was one of them. It started small. The whispers in the hallway as he walked by. "How long do you think he'll last? Bet he won't make it past a month. He doesn't belong here." Dante pretended not to hear. He focused on his classes, ignored the stares, and stuck to the routine. But he knew better than to think it would stop there. Soon, the small things became bigger. One afternoon, as Dante opened his locker to grab his books, a sudden shove sent him crashing forward. His shoulder slammed into the cold metal, the loud bang echoing down the hallway. Laughter followed. "Oops." Dante clenched his jaw and turned back to his locker. He didn't react. He wouldn't give them what they wanted. But Connell wasn't the type to give up easily. The next day, in the cafeteria, Dante walked toward the trash cans when a foot shot out in front of him. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't meant to be. Dante barely caught himself before falling, but his tray wasn't so lucky. His drink spilled, food splattered onto the floor. More laughter. Connell leaned back in his chair, hands up in mock innocence. "Relax, man. It was just a joke." Dante exhaled through his nose. Just a joke. He had heard that before. Bullies always had a way of making their harassment seem harmless. Dante said nothing. He stepped over Connell's foot and kept walking. The laughter died down as he disappeared into the crowd. But that wasn't enough for them. Because the third time, it wasn't a joke. It was after school. Most of the students had already gone home. The parking lot was half empty, the sky painted in warm shades of orange and purple. Dante wasn't in a hurry. His mom wouldn't be home for a few hours, and he didn't mind taking his time. That's when he heard the voices. Too familiar. "Hey, new guy." Dante barely had time to react before something slammed into his back. He staggered forward, catching himself just before hitting the pavement. Laughter. He turned slowly. Connell stood there, flanked by his usual crew, still holding his drink cup. The last few drops dripped from his fingers. "Damn, my bad," Connell said, not even pretending to sound sorry. "Didn't see you there." Dante looked down. His hoodie was drenched, ice cubes scattered at his feet. A long silence stretched between them. Other students lingering in the parking lot had stopped to watch. Dante inhaled through his nose, steadying himself. Connell smirked. "Come on, man, say something." Dante didn't. He just set down his backpack. The smirk on Connell's face widened. "Oh, so now you want to do something?" Dante rolled his shoulders back. And this time, he didn't walk away. Dante had never been the type to look for a fight. But that didn't mean he would run from one. He had been patient. He had let things slide. He had ignored every push, every whisper, every shove. But Connell wasn't going to stop. And now, standing in the near-empty parking lot with the last of the sunset fading behind him, Dante knew there was no avoiding this. Connell stood in front of him, that same smug grin on his face, his crew watching closely from behind. They weren't going to jump in. Not yet. This was Connell's game, and he wanted to play it himself. "You think you're something special?" Connell taunted, stepping closer. Dante said nothing. He just stared. The smirk on Connell's face widened. "Come on, man. You gonna do something or just stand there?" Dante could feel his heart beat steady, his breath slow and controlled. He had spent years training for moments like this, but never for reasons like this. Then Connell moved. A quick shove to the chest, hard enough to provoke, but not enough to be a full-blown attack. Dante barely shifted. "What, you scared?" one of Connell's friends jeered. Dante let out a slow breath. Not scared, just done. Then he struck. One step forward, quick, clean. A sharp left feint, just enough to make Connell react. And then a solid right hook straight to the ribs. The thud of impact was sickening. Connell's breath hitched in a sharp gasp as his body folded. But Dante wasn't done. With a quick pivot, he launched an uppercut, perfectly placed. Connell's head snapped back. His eyes went wide, legs stumbling as his body betrayed him. And then he hit the pavement. Hard. Silence. No one moved. No one spoke. The entire lot had frozen. Dante took a step back, adjusting his hoodie. His breath was steady, controlled. He had done what needed to be done, nothing more, nothing less. Connell groaned, rolling onto his side, coughing. He didn't have a comeback this time. Dante finally spoke. "You done?" Connell didn't answer. He just coughed again. Dante scanned the faces of the others, Nick, Kyle, and the rest. Anyone else? No one moved. Dante grabbed his backpack and slung it over his shoulder. He didn't wait for another word. He just walked away. But deep down, he knew what happened in that parking lot wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. By the next morning, the entire school knew. Dante didn't need to check his phone to figure that out. The way people looked at him said everything. The stares weren't just curiosity anymore. They were different. Some were impressed. Some were nervous. A few looked at him like they were seeing him for the first time. Connell wasn't at school. That didn't surprise Dante. Taking a hit like that in front of half the parking lot wasn't something you bounced back from overnight. Nick and Kyle kept their distance. That didn't surprise him either. Dante walked into class like nothing had happened, sat down, pulled out his notebook. Business as usual. But that didn't mean people were done talking. At lunch, as he moved through the cafeteria, conversations lowered to whispers when he passed. Some nodded at him, like they suddenly respected him. Freshmen who had never spoken to him before now acted like he was some kind of legend. And then there were the others. Didn't know the new guy had hands, someone muttered as he walked by. Connell had it coming, another voice added. Heard he's not coming back for a week. Dante ignored it. He wasn't here to be a hero. He wasn't looking for validation. Then he heard something else. It is just another violent thug. The words were soft, but not soft enough. Dante turned his head slightly. A couple of girls at a nearby table. one of them a brunette with expensive-looking jewelry and an expression like she smelled something bad, looked away when she realized he had heard her. His stomach clenched. That was the thing about moments like these. No matter how justified you were, no matter how right the situation felt, someone always found a way to twist it. But he didn't regret it. Conal had gone looking for a fight. Dante just made sure he got one. Still, the weight of it all sat on him. He had spent years training, years controlling himself, years walking away. That wasn't weakness, that was strength. So why did it feel like no matter what choice he made, people had already decided who he was? A hand clapped his shoulder, pulling him out of his thoughts. Dante looked up. "Coach Robert. Got a minute?" Dante hesitated. He wasn't in the mood for a lecture. But something in the coach's tone made him stop. They walked outside, standing near the track where the football team was finishing practice. Robert studied him for a moment. "I heard what happened." Dante nodded. He wasn't going to apologize. Robert exhaled. Figured you had your reasons." Then he crossed his arms. "Let me ask you something. Do you think that fight changed anything?" Dante frowned, unsure where this was going. Robert tilted his head, watching him. "You think Conal learned something? You think the rest of them did?" Dante exhaled, running a hand over his head. He knew the answer, and so did Robert. Dante knew Conal would come back. Someone like him wouldn't just let it go. Not after what happened. Not after losing in front of half the school. And sure enough, 2 days later, Conal returned to Ridgewood High. At lunch, the air in the cafeteria was thick with anticipation. Conversations slowed, students turned their heads, and all eyes followed Conal as he entered the room. He wasn't the same as before. No cocky grin, no careless swagger. But he wasn't afraid either. Dante sat at his usual table, calmly eating his food. He knew what was coming. And then Conal walked straight toward him. The cafeteria fell silent. Dante put his fork down, his body tense, ready. If Conal wanted a rematch, he wasn't getting one here. But then, something unexpected happened. Conal stopped in front of him, and instead of throwing a punch, he held out his hand. Dante froze. For the first time since coming to Ridgewood, he had no idea what was about to happen. Was this a challenge? A trick? Some kind of twisted joke? Or was it something else? The entire room watched in suspense. Dante stared at the outstretched hand, his mind racing. If he shook it, what would it mean? That everything was over? That they were equals now? Or was this just another game? Conal's expression was unreadable. He was waiting. The whole school was waiting. Dante's fingers twitched. He could feel the weight of every pair of eyes on him, every expectation, every unspoken judgment. He could shake his hand and let it all go. Or he could refuse and let the war continue. But instead he did neither. Dante didn't shake his hand. But he didn't move away either. He just looked at Conal. For a long, heavy moment, no one spoke. Then, slowly, Conal gave a small nod. And without another word, he turned and walked away. The tension in the room didn't break immediately. It held for a second longer, as if no one could quite believe what had just happened. Then conversations picked up again, the cafeteria noise returning in waves. Dante let out a quiet breath. He didn't know if what happened meant he had won. But for the first time, it didn't feel like a loss. That afternoon, Dante sat alone in the empty bleachers of the school stadium. The air was crisp, the faint scent of cut grass lingering. In the distance, the football team was wrapping up their practice, their shouts and whistles echoing across the field. But Dante wasn't paying attention. His mind was still in the cafeteria. What had just happened? He hadn't shaken Conal's hand. But he hadn't rejected it either. He had expected a fight, or at the very least, another round of mind games. But instead, Conal had simply walked away. Did that mean it was over? Did it mean anything at all? A familiar voice pulled him from his thoughts. "Thinking about today?" Dante turned. "Coach Robert." The older man sat down beside him, resting his arms on his knees as he stared out at the field. You made a choice in there. Dante sighed. I don't know if it was the right one. Robert smirked. That's how you know it wasn't an easy one. They sat in silence for a moment before Robert spoke again. Let me ask you something. What would shaking his hand have changed? Dante thought about it. Would it have made things better, or just given people something new to talk about? Robert continued, and what about another fight? Would that have solved anything? Dante exhaled. No, it wouldn't have. Robert leaned back. See, people like Conal, they don't really lose, not in a way that sticks. They have backup, resources, second chances. He turned to Dante. But you can't afford to get caught in a cycle that'll only end one way. Dante stared down at the ground. He had spent so much time reacting, avoiding, fighting. But what if there was another way? Robert nudged his chin toward the far side of the field. I've been telling the wrestling coach to send me a few kids. You ever thought about putting all that skill to better use? Dante blinked. Wrestling? Robert grinned. I know you can handle yourself, that much is obvious, but there's a difference between winning a fight and learning how to own your power. Dante hesitated. Fighting had always been about survival, about standing his ground, but this wasn't about proving something to anyone else. Maybe, just maybe, this was about proving something to himself. That night, he sat on his bed, staring at his uncle's old boxing gloves. He thought about every time he had held back, every time he had walked away, and the one time he hadn't. Robert was right. Conal wasn't going to change. People would think what they wanted. But Dante still had a choice. And this time he was going to make a different one. The next day, he found Robert before practice. How do I? Robert smiled. Be here at 4. Don't be late. And just like that, Dante knew. Real strength wasn't just about knowing when to fight. It was about knowing what to fight for. In life, we will always face challenges, prejudices, and people who try to bring us down. Sometimes we have to choose between staying silent, fighting back, or finding another way. Dante didn't seek trouble, but he also couldn't let others define who he was. A punch might win a moment, but self-control wins in the long run. His story reflects a truth about today's world. Real strength isn't about defeating others, it's about mastering yourself. When faced with injustice, we must know when to stand up and when to walk away. When labeled unfairly, we don't need to prove ourselves to everyone. We only need to stay true to our values. Growth doesn't come from winning fights. It comes from turning struggles into opportunities for personal development. Use your strength wisely, because true victory isn't about taking someone down. It's about becoming the best version of yourself.